You probably think you know what won World War II. Tanks rolling across Europe, soldiers storming beaches, generals poring over battlefield maps and candlelit tents. These are the images burned into our collective memory, loud, dramatic, cinematic. But hidden behind that frontline glory is a quieter, grittier story, one that never made it into the history books or the big-budget war movies. It is the story of the drivers, the unsung lifeline of the war. The young men who did not carry rifles but carried everything else. This is the story of the Red Ball Express. In the summer of 1944, after Allied forces broke out of Normandy, they began advancing faster than anyone had predicted. Cities were liberated, roads reclaimed, and German forces pushed back with relentless speed. But victory created a new problem: logistics. The faster the Allies advanced, the harder it became to keep them supplied. Railroads had been bombed into oblivion. Ports were either damaged or were still under enemy control. The front lines were outrunning their own supply chains. So they turned to trucks. Thousands of them. And behind every steering wheel, a young man barely out of high school. Many of them had never left their hometowns, never driven anything bigger than a pickup, never imagined that war would mean 16-hour days behind the wheel through shattered villages and pitch-black nights. These drivers became the arteries of the Allied war machine, pumping fuel, ammunition, food, and hope to the troops who depended on them. You are about to step into the boots of one of those drivers. Before we dive in, if you enjoy stories like this where history gets personal, where the forgotten corners of the past come alive, please consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel. It helps more than you know and allows us to keep bringing you real stories of ordinary people doing extraordinary things. And hey, drop a comment below with where you are watching from. We love hearing how far these stories travel. Now, get comfortable, pull up your blanket, dim the lights, and settle in, because we are heading back to 1944. You are about to meet James Wilson, a 19-year-old from Cleveland, Ohio. You will ride with him through rainstorms, blackouts, and fire-scarred towns. You will feel the engine rumble beneath you and the weight of responsibility pressing down like a 1,000-pound load strapped to the back of a GMC truck. This is not a story about medals or glory. It is about grit, about showing up every day and doing your job even when it is thankless, dangerous, and exhausting. It is about war from the cab of a truck, and once you hear it, you will never look at World War II the same way again. It began with a problem no one expected to have not in war. The Allied forces, having stormed the beaches of Normandy in June 1944, were advancing so fast across France that their own supply chains could not keep up. For every village liberated, every mile gained, there was an urgent question: how do you keep an entire army moving forward without running dry? You can have the tanks, the guns, the men, but without fuel, bullets, and food, they all stop cold. That was the terrifying reality facing the commanders. And so, from this crisis of momentum, something extraordinary was born: the Red Ball Express. Named after the red circle symbol used to designate priority traffic, the Red Ball Express was not just a convoy, it was an industrial miracle. Within days, military planners assembled a sprawling network of routes stretching from the temporary ports at Normandy deep into the European mainland. The rules were strict, the execution relentless. The roads were closed to all other traffic. Convoys had assigned speeds, scheduled departure times, and precise spacing between trucks. It was not glamorous, but it was essential. Each truck carried life to the front lines: fuel for tanks, ammunition for rifles, rations for soldiers too tired to even chew properly. Everything the fighting force needed had to arrive by truck, day and night, rain or shine. To make this work, the U.S. Army called up thousands of drivers, many of whom had never imagined they would find themselves behind the wheel in a war zone. Young men, some barely 18, were pulled from gas stations, farms, and small-town garages, their only qualification being a familiarity with engines and a willingness to serve. Among them was our guide through this journey, James Wilson, 19. From Cleveland, Ohio. Not a soldier in the traditional sense, but a mechanic's assistant turned motor transport driver. Dropped into the chaos of post-D-Day Europe and told, simply, to keep driving. For men like Wilson, the war was not about firefights or battle plans. It was about staying awake for 20-hour stretches, about dodging bomb craters on dark country roads, about wading through axle-deep mud just to get a truck started. Their cargo was stacked high fuel drums lashed down with canvas straps, crates of ammunition tied tight against bouncing axles. Every trip was a race against time. If a truck broke down, it was not just a mechanical failure, it was a potential delay in battle. If a convoy was ambushed, it did not just mean danger for the drivers, it meant starving the front line of what it needed to push forward. There were few comforts. The cabs of those GMC Jimmy trucks were hot in the day, freezing at night, and always coated in dust. Goggles fogged up. Engines overheated. Rations were basic beans, Spam, and whatever the cooks could throw together in a field mess tent. Sleep came in snatches, sometimes on the side of the road, head resting on the steering wheel, and still cooling. Letters from home arrived sporadically, if at all. And yet, in the middle of all that discomfort, danger, and fatigue, the drivers built something remarkable, a rhythm, a purpose, a shared identity. The roads they drove were not always roads at all. They were dirt tracks chewed up by tank treads, stone paths lined with shattered trees, makeshift lanes plowed through fields. At night, blackout conditions meant no headlights, just the dim red cat eyes mounted on the trucks ahead. If you saw all 4 cat eyes clearly, you were too close. If they disappeared completely, you were too far behind. In fog or rain, it was like following ghosts. One wrong move, one missed signal, and the whole line could come to a stop, or worse, crash. The danger was not theoretical. German aircraft still prowled the skies, and rear guard troops sometimes launched surprise attacks. Drivers were armed, yes, but poorly trained in combat. They were taught to keep the trucks rolling, not to shoot back. When a convoy was hit, it was chaos, supplies scattered, tires shredded, engines burning. But even then, the order was the same: recover what you can, regroup, and keep moving. And somehow, incredibly, they did. Over just 3 months, the Red Ball Express delivered over 400,000 tons of supplies to the front. At its peak, it involved nearly 6,000 vehicles and over 23,000 men, many of them African American. Soldiers who, despite facing discrimination within the military, carried out their duties with dedication and skill. These drivers became the veins and arteries of the war machine, ensuring the heart the combat force kept pumping forward. Their names rarely made headlines. Their heroics were not captured in war reels or propaganda posters. But ask any frontline officer from that campaign, and they will tell you, without the Red Ball Express, the advance would have stalled. The war might have dragged on. Thousands more might have died. It is easy to overlook the logistics of war, to forget the invisible labor that powers visible victories. But the Red Ball Express was not just a logistical footnote. It was a lifeline, forged in desperation and sustained by determination. Every crate unloaded, every drum of fuel delivered, every mile driven through mud and shellfire was an act of quiet defiance. A reminder that victory is not only won by those who fire the shots, but also by those who make sure the bullets arrive on time. And as you ride with Wilson through the wrecked villages of France, past cheering civilians and under skies filled with uncertainty, remember this: the road behind him is littered with stories of perseverance, of hardship, of duty without glory. And ahead, only more road. Because the job is not done until the last crate is unloaded, the last tank is filled, the last soldier fed. That is the mission. That is the Red Ball Express. James Wilson had never left Ohio before the war. At just 19, He spent most of his teenage years under the hood of cars at his uncle's gas station in Cleveland. Grease-streaked hands, long summer afternoons fixing fan belts and pumping fuel, and nights spent dreaming about a different kind of future, maybe one with chrome fenders and open highways. War was the stuff of newspapers, headlines, and faraway places. That changed quickly when his draft notice came. Before he could even pack a bag, James found himself in a new uniform, standing in line with hundreds of other young men. Just as wide-eyed and uncertain as he was, there was no fanfare when he was assigned to logistics. No medals or parades for truck drivers. Just a quiet order: deliver supplies. That was it. No one asked if he would ever driven a 2.25 half-ton truck over muddy back roads, or if he could read a map in the dark. He had driven pickups around town, sure, but this was something else entirely. His training was brief, barely enough to learn how to shift gears without stalling. And within weeks, he was shipped to England, then across the Channel to France. When James first heard the words Red Ball Express, they did not mean much to him. They were thrown around by officers and printed on movement orders, but soon he learned it was something far bigger than he imagined. The Red Ball Express was a lifeline, a 24-hour-a-day convoy operation with one goal: keep the advancing Allied forces fed, fueled, and armed as they moved deeper into occupied Europe. After the breakout from Normandy, the front lines were pushing forward faster than anyone expected. The ports were still damaged, rail lines were not functional, and the only way to move tens of thousands of tons of supplies was by truck. Hundreds of them. Thousands. Eventually, he was handed a clipboard, a route, and a truck that looked like it had already survived one war. Then he was told to follow the Red Ball's painted signs and flags that marked the special supply routes cleared just for them. And then he was off. No escort, no map, just trust in the convoy ahead of him and faith that the road would lead where it needed to go. At first, James found it almost exciting. The freedom of the road, the sense of purpose. He was doing something vital, even if no one back home would ever know his name. But it did not take long for the reality to sink in. The Red Ball Express was not a smooth ride through the countryside. It was a grueling, endless loop of loading, driving, unloading, and starting all over again. The roads were barely roads at all, just rutted paths through destroyed villages and bombed-out bridges. Mud, dust, and debris were constant enemies. Tires blew out. Engines overheated. And there was always the looming threat of enemy fire or sabotage. James did not sleep much. There was not time. The operation ran day and night, non-stop. Convoys moved in one direction, unloaded, then returned immediately. Drivers were expected to eat on the move, often with one hand on the wheel and the other holding a sandwich or a cup of watery coffee. They used gas masks, not for poison, but to filter out the thick black exhaust from the trucks ahead of them. There were no headlights allowed at night, only small cat-eye reflectors on the back of the truck in front. Lose sight of them, and you were lost in the dark. What made it harder was how young most of them were. Boys like James, some even younger. Most had never fired a gun, much less driven through a war zone. They came from gas stations, farms, and factories. Their hands were calloused from honest labor, not combat. And yet, here they were, dodging artillery craters, navigating landmines, and delivering vital cargo to men depending on them. He remembered one run in particular. It was cold, late fall, and a mist hung low over the hills. The truck in front of him had slowed unexpectedly, and James instinctively tapped the brakes, only to feel the back end of his vehicle slide on the wet gravel. He wrestled with the wheel, trying to regain control, but the truck skidded sideways, its load of fuel barrels threatening to topple. He managed to steady it, heart pounding, hands slick with sweat despite the chill. When he finally stopped at the supply depot, his knees were shaking so badly he could barely climb down from the cab. But he did it. They all did. Day after day, They did not ask for medals or glory. Most did not get either. But James knew that every box of ammunition he delivered, every gallon of fuel he hauled, helped push the Allies 1 mile closer to victory. And he was not alone. Thousands of young drivers just like him kept the Red Ball Express rolling, fueled by determination, exhaustion, and a deep sense of duty. It was not the kind of heroism that made it into history books, but without them, there would have been no final push into Germany, no liberation of Paris, no end to the war. For James Wilson and his fellow drivers, the battlefield was the road, and the enemy was time. They drove not for medals, but for the men ahead of them who needed what they carried. And in doing so, they proved that courage does not always come with a weapon in hand. Sometimes it comes with a steering wheel, a full tank of gas, and the resolve to never stop moving forward. Of all the memories James Wilson carried from the war, the mornings were the most vivid. They began before the sun even dared to rise, when the mist still clung to the ground like a second skin, and the cold seeped through every layer of clothing. In the makeshift truck camps that sprawled across the French countryside, Réveil did not come with a trumpet or ceremony. It came with the groan of diesel engines sputtering to life, the bark of a sergeant's orders slicing through fog, and the ever-present stink of wet canvas and unwashed uniforms. James, barely 19, had traded a gas pump in Cleveland for a convoy truck, and now each day was a test of endurance. The campgrounds were never dry. Rain was a constant companion, and the mud became a second terrain to navigate. Thick, sucking, inescapable. Tents sagged under the weight of water. Boots were never dry, and the cold had a way of finding the spaces between seams and buttons. There was no real sleep, just short, fitful moments of rest, interrupted by the grumble of engines or the abrupt order to move. The Red Ball Express was not a romantic notion of war. It was a relentless grind. James would wake up aching, stretch stiff limbs, and throw on his damp gear. Breakfast, if it came at all, was powdered eggs and burnt coffee consumed while standing. Then came the inspection of the truck, a task that seemed futile in the face of so much wear and tear, but was essential. Tires had to be checked for slow leaks, lights examined, oil topped up. A faulty engine meant more than delay. It could mean abandonment, isolation, or worse, being caught alone on a road where the enemy still roamed. Once the convoy was formed, they hit the road, and the real battle began. The weather was merciless. Autumn storms lashed at the windshields. Fog obscured the roads, and snow began to creep into the landscape as the months wore on. The roads themselves were battlefields of a different kind, cratered by bombs, slick with mud, choked with wreckage. Each trip tested not only James's driving skills, but his nerve. There were no guardrails, no luxuries. Visibility often dropped to a few feet, and the only navigation aid was the truck ahead. If it did not veer into a ditch, neither would you. But the true fatigue was not just physical. It was mental, emotional. James had to remain alert for 12, sometimes 16 hours at a stretch. A moment of inattention could cost lives. He was responsible not just for his cargo fuel drums, ammunition crates, rations, but for the safety of the men in the vehicles around him. There were times when sleep clawed at him, when the road blurred into a monotony of gray and brown, and it took every ounce of willpower to keep his hands on the wheel. Breaks were few and brief. Sometimes they stopped to refuel or wait for clearance at checkpoints, but those pauses offered little relief. There was no place to sit comfortably, no dry spot to relax. The men stood around the trucks, smoked if they had cigarettes, shared stories of home if they had the energy. Then it was back behind the wheel. The day bled into night, and headlights pierced the darkness in long lines of grinding motion. Enemy aircraft were always a threat, and so the convoys moved fast, often without lights, relying on spacing and coordination, hoping the Luftwaffe would not find them. When they returned to camp, it was never early. James would stumble from the cab, legs numb, back screaming, eyelids heavy. The reward, a cot in a wet tent, maybe a hot meal, maybe just a tin of beans eaten in silence. But even sleep was not peace. Engines idled nearby, Trucks rumbled off in new directions, and somewhere, always, an officer was shouting. What kept James going was not orders or duty alone. It was the knowledge that without him, and thousands like him, the front would starve. The Red Ball Express was the lifeline of the Allied push toward Germany, and though he was young and weary, James knew every gallon of fuel and every box of ammo he delivered might mean the difference between victory and stalemate. This was not the war of flags and heroics. It was the war of grit and grease, of calloused hands and sleepless nights. James never saw a battlefield up close, but every mile he drove, every dawn he rose from that muddy ground, was a small battle won. And in those endless roads and darkened camps, he found a quiet kind of courage, the kind that held the whole war together. Even as the world threatened to fall apart, the road ahead was never smooth, never certain. For the men of the Red Ball Express, each mile, driven through France's war-torn countryside, came with the heavy weight of uncertainty. The convoys snaked their way across shattered terrain, moving through towns that had only days earlier been occupied by enemy forces. Buildings stood hollowed by shell fire, smoke still curling from the ruins. The road itself, if it could even be called, that was often cratered, choked with debris, and in many places barely wide enough for the long lines of trucks grinding forward with their precious cargo. James Wilson, the young driver from Cleveland, had quickly come to understand that this was not just a job behind the wheel, it was a battle in its own right. He and the others were not soldiers with rifles. They were soldiers of motion, fighting time, terrain, and the ever-lurking shadow of ambush. Each delivery was a mission, each trip a test of nerves. The Red Ball Express had to move fast. The entire Allied offensive depended on it. General Patton's tanks could not roll without gasoline. Infantry units could not press forward without food and ammunition. So the convoys ran day and night, relentlessly. But speed came at a cost. Corners were taken too fast, engines overheated, and sometimes, in the dark of night, trucks simply disappeared, swallowed by the land or by enemy fire. Though the main roads were marked with red ball symbols that gave the express its name, the route was far from safe. German snipers still haunted the shadows of partially liberated towns. Mines and booby traps left behind by retreating enemy units were a constant threat. And overhead, the rumble of Luftwaffe aircraft occasionally pierced the skies, reminding the drivers that air superiority was never absolute. At night, the dangers multiplied. Convoy lights had to be dimmed to avoid detection, and communication between trucks often broke down entirely. James recalled one particularly harrowing night near Argentan. The rain had turned the roads into mud rivers. His windshield wipers could barely keep up. A sudden explosion lit up the horizon. The lead truck had hit a mine. The rest of the convoy had to halt in the downpour, waiting hours for engineers to arrive and clear the way forward. They sat there, wet and cold, engines idling, unsure if a second blast might follow. Wreckage littered the way forward. Burned-out German vehicles, Allied tanks disabled in the earlier fighting, and the blackened frames of civilian carts and homes all served as grim milestones along the journey. Yet the drivers kept going. Some cursed loudly, others drove in silence, but no one turned back. Sometimes they passed refugees, French civilians, walking with everything they owned in handcarts or on their backs. Many waved in gratitude. Some looked on with hollow eyes. Exhausted from years of war, James always made a point to wave back. It reminded him what they were fighting for, not just victory, but relief, dignity, and a chance at rebuilding a shattered world. There were moments of fear, too. Once, a convoy ahead of James's unit was ambushed just outside Mortain. A group of German soldiers, believed to have been bypassed in the retreat, opened fire with machine guns from a forested ridge. 2 trucks exploded before the others could escape down a side road. By the time infantry reinforcements arrived, the attackers had vanished. James did not know the names of the drivers who died, but he never forgot the sight of their burned-out vehicles. still smoldering when he passed the next morning. In other areas, the infrastructure itself was the enemy. France's roads, never built for the weight of military trucks, crumbled under the constant pressure. Makeshift bridges collapsed, forcing detours through fields and river crossings that tested both man and machine. Trucks got stuck in the mud, and it often fell on fellow drivers to help haul them out, sacrificing precious time and risking exposure in the process. Breakdowns were common. Each driver had to become a makeshift mechanic. James learned to change a tire in under 10 minutes, patch a fuel line with tape and wire, and coax an overheated engine back to life using every trick he could think of. But even the most skilled could only do so much. Sometimes a truck would be left behind, its cargo transferred to another under the weight of new urgency. Despite all this, morale among the drivers remained surprisingly high. There was camaraderie forged in hardship, a bond that only those who shared the road could understand. At the end of each run, if they were lucky enough to stop at a rest depot, James and the others would gather around fires, eating canned rations, telling stories, and laughing louder than the war could silence. Every successful trip was a small victory, and each one added up. Thanks to the Red Ball Express, the Allied advance did not stall. The front kept moving forward. Town after town was liberated, and every liberated mile meant new hope. The drivers knew they were not the ones planting flags or making headlines, but they did not need medals to understand their worth. They could see it in the faces of the soldiers they supplied, in the speed of the tanks they fueled, and in the road stretching endlessly ahead. A road that, despite all odds, they were helping to pave toward victory. The thunder of engines never stopped. From the moment the Red Ball Express was born out of necessity, the rhythm of its convoys became a relentless drumbeat, pulsing through the arteries of liberated France. By the fall of 1944, the front lines of the Allied advance stretched faster and farther than any commander had anticipated. Tanks needed fuel. Artillery demanded shells. Troops counted on food and medical supplies, and at the heart of this logistical miracle were the men of the Red Ball Express, pressing forward no matter the hour, weather, or risk. James Wilson, like many of his fellow drivers, was barely out of high school. His life back in Cleveland had been simple filling gas tanks, chatting with neighbors, fixing old sedans. But in war, that past felt like a dream he would once had and forgotten. Now, every morning he woke in the chill of dawn, boots caked in mud, jacket damp from the dew that clung to the canvas of his tent. He barely had time to swallow a spoonful of watery oatmeal before he was back behind the wheel, engine roaring as he merged into the convoy line, headlights blacked out, trusting the dim glow of the vehicle ahead and a sense of instinct he had not known he possessed. The Red Ball Express was no free-for-all. From day one, the operation was bound by strict rules and tighter schedules. Only military vehicles marked with a red ball were allowed on designated roads. Speed limits were enforced, not just for safety, but to preserve the battered roadways that snaked through Normandy's countryside. Convoys were timed down to the minute delays could mean entire divisions stalled without supplies. Trucks ran in columns, and drivers were warned never to break formation unless under threat of attack or mechanical failure. Stopping without authorization was a punishable offense. Even eating or relieving oneself had to wait until a scheduled pause. In this race, time was not just money, it was survival. Driving under blackout conditions was an art form. At night, headlights were forbidden to avoid giving away positions to the enemy. Instead, small slits of light, shielded by hoods, provided just enough glow to see the bumper ahead. Rain turned roads into soup. Fog swallowed visibility whole. Potholes cracked axles and burst tires. Still, the trucks kept rolling. Every mile counted. Every delay rippled forward into the chaos of war. James often drove 14 to 16 hours straight, gripping the wheel with aching hands. Eyes bloodshot, brain wired from nerves and adrenaline. Conversations were brief. There was no room for pleasantries on the road. A missed turn could send the convoy into uncharted danger. A broken-down truck could block dozens behind it. Everyone had to keep moving. And always, in the distance, the rumble of war served as a constant reminder that they were not far from the line between life and death. There was pressure from above, too. Officers demanded results. Supplies had to reach the front faster than the enemy could regroup. Commanders tracked convoy performance with military precision. Drivers received orders with no room for negotiation. You moved fast. You moved right. Or someone else would take your place. That pressure bred excellence, but it also broke men. Fatigue led to accidents. Stress led to mistakes. Sometimes drivers fell asleep behind the wheel. Sometimes they did not wake up again. Yet, despite the chaos, there was pride. These were not frontline soldiers, but they knew they were making victory possible. They were the reason tanks could roll. They were the reason medics had bandages and plasma. James remembered how once, near the outskirts of Paris, his convoy had been flagged down by a weary infantry unit. They needed food. Wilson's truck had rations. He shared what he could. One of the soldiers clapped him on the shoulder, thanked him like he was a hero. That moment stayed with him longer than any medal. Through towns reduced to rubble, past fields still littered with shell casings, the Red Ball Express thundered forward. It was never glamorous. It was never easy, but it was essential. Without the convoy, the war might have stalled. And without the grit of drivers like James Wilson, the convoy would not have lasted a week. So, as the trucks roared on through France, through rain and rubble and fatigue, they carried more than supplies, they carried the weight of victory. And they never let it fall. When James Wilson clambered into the cab of his GMC truck each morning, he was not just preparing for another grueling supply run along the battered roads of war-torn France, he was also bracing for the very real possibility that his machine might fail him. And out here, between the shattered remains of towns and the ever-present threat of enemy fire, there was no mechanic shop waiting at the next stop. The drivers of the Red Ball Express had to become their own lifeline. It was not a skill most of them brought from home. Back in Cleveland, James pumped gas and checked oil for polished Buicks and shiny Packards in the quiet lull of suburban calm. But now, he was behind the wheel of a 2.5-ton truck, barreling through the mud-soaked countryside with drums of gasoline clanking in the back and the engine rattling with fatigue. Every trip wore the trucks down, suspensions groaned, tires gave out, and engines overheated in ways the training manuals never fully explained. The roads were unforgiving. Paved sections were rare, and much of the journey meant bouncing across fields hastily converted into thoroughfares or negotiating bridges that had only recently been cleared of wreckage. Sharp debris from abandoned equipment or battles past could shred a tire in seconds. Radiators cracked from overuse or enemy shrapnel. And in those moments, the convoy did not stop. It could not afford to. So the drivers became roadside mechanics, taught not in formal classrooms but by necessity and survival. If something snapped, you pulled over, preferably behind a hedgerow if you could find one, and got to work, your eyes scanning the horizon for more than just parts. German patrols still roamed nearby woods. The sky was not always friendly, but stopping meant delaying critical supplies, and delays could cost lives on the front lines. James quickly learned to patch a radiator with chewing gum and a strip of cloth. Others used coffee grounds to stop small leaks in the fuel system. An old trick passed down from one desperate driver to another. One soldier even turned a broken mess kit into a makeshift fan belt. They scrounged from abandoned vehicles, cannibalizing broken parts from wrecks or creatively rewiring electrical systems with field telephone wire. This was not just ingenuity, it was survival. And while they worked, the clock never stopped ticking. The Red Ball Express operated under relentless schedules. Trucks needed to stay moving day and night, with blackout conditions at night that made even basic maintenance a trial of touch and instinct. Flashlights were forbidden to avoid detection, so men learned to feel their way along an engine block in the dark, their fingers tracing bolts and fluid lines by memory. The Army had issued basic toolkits, wrenches, screwdrivers, pliers, but these were rarely enough. Improvised tools were born out of desperation. A driver might bend a tent stake into a pry bar or fashion a socket extender from a length of pipe. Duct tape became a miracle cure, used for everything from sealing hoses to holding together cracked windshields. Each truck was like a soldier's partner, temperamental, imperfect, but essential. The drivers came to know their machines intimately. James could tell when his engine was about to overheat by the way it groaned uphill. He knew just how far he could push the brakes before they locked, how many miles he could drive before needing to check the oil. And when a truck finally gave out beyond repair, it felt like losing a friend. Sometimes they left messages scrawling grease on the hood before stripping the wreck for parts. Small notes to the next driver who might find it, or maybe just to say goodbye. But despite these obstacles, the men kept going. The mechanics back at the base depots did what they could, but out on the road, there were no guarantees. It was the driver's grit, creativity, and bond with his machine that kept the supply lines alive. And their work made the difference. The Allied advance did not stall. Tanks rolled forward with fuel. Infantry had rations, and artillery had shells because someone like James had fixed a shattered axle with little more than wire. Determination in dirty hands. It was not glamorous, and few medals were given for grease under the nails. But in the long line of history, the quiet heroism of these roadside repairs kept the war machine moving. In the long convoy stretching from Normandy toward Paris, it was not just trucks on the move. It was the resilience and resourcefulness of young men, barely trained, far from home, learning to solve problems on the fly with nothing but sweat and sheer willpower. For James Wilson and thousands like him, the war was not fought only with rifles or on the front lines. It was fought on the back roads of France, under broken clouds and behind steaming hoods. With every improvised repair, a small victory in the relentless drive toward liberation. As the sun dipped behind the war-torn horizon of France, the roads that once echoed with the thundering boots of invading armies now buzzed with a different kind of urgency. This was no ordinary convoy. These were the men of the Red Ball Express drivers who lived on caffeine, adrenaline, and the hope of daylight. Among them was a young man from Mississippi named Ray Carter. Barely 20, he had once fueled sedans at a gas station and now found himself behind the wheel of a 2.5-ton truck, rumbling into the uncertain dark of Europe's backroads. Night was their constant companion. But this was not the comforting darkness of sleep. It was the kind of black that swallowed sound and reason, the kind that hid shattered buildings, retreating enemies, and twisted trees alike. Army regulations forbade the use of headlights. Instead, drivers were equipped with cat-eye lights, small, dim bulbs that cast just enough of a glow to follow the truck ahead, but not enough to reveal themselves to potential threats lurking in the shadows. It was like threading a needle in the dark, but at 40 miles an hour, over potholes, rubble, and bridges that might have been sabotaged just hours earlier. Visibility was near zero. Imagine steering thousands of pounds of equipment over unfamiliar terrain with only a thin ribbon of road shimmering like a ghost in front of you. One wrong swerve, and you are not just in a ditch, you might take the whole convoy with you. Ray once described it as driving blindfolded with a loaded gun in your lap and a ticking clock in your ear. The pressure to deliver supplies was immense. Every tank, every rifle, every soldier at the front relied on the lifeline they carried. The trucks rolled regardless of the weather, the terrain, or the time of day. And when night fell, there was no pause, only shadows and the soft humming of engines trying not to be heard. There were no GPS devices, no streetlights, and no shoulder to pull over onto when fatigue crept in. Some drivers tied themselves to the steering wheel so they would not slump forward if they dozed off. Others sang, yelled, or bit their tongues to stay awake. Ray once told of a friend who kept a photo of home taped to the dash, just under the speedometer. It reminded him what he was driving toward, he said, and what he had to live for. But driving in blackout was not just about staying awake, it was about staying alive. Enemy aircraft still patrolled the skies, and a stray beam of light could invite death from above. On the ground, the risks were no less daunting. Roads shifted with battle lines. One night, a bridge might be passable. The next, it was rubble. Entire sections of route were marked only by hastily painted signs and the fading tire tracks of the convoy before. And then there was the fog. Not the gentle, rolling kind that blanketed your backyard on an autumn morning. This was dense, suffocating fog that seeped into every crack and dulled even the faint cat eyes until it felt like you were submerged in gray water. Ray remembered one night when visibility dropped so low that trucks had to stop entirely, stacking up in eerie silence along the roadside like metal coffins. The drivers sat inside, engines idling, afraid to turn on a light, speak too loudly, or even open the door. Still, the red ball rolled on. What made it even more extraordinary was that most of these men were not seasoned soldiers. Many, like Ray, had never been more than 100 miles from home before they landed in Normandy. Yet here they were, navigating terrain so treacherous that even combat units hesitated to cross it after sundown. They did it because the front needed them. They did it because the trucks would not drive themselves. And they did it, often, without recognition or rest. Each journey was a test of endurance, of courage, and of sheer willpower. Every delivery completed under the veil of night meant lives saved, battles won, momentum maintained. The Allies could not afford delay, and the drivers knew it. So they pushed on through darkness, through fear, through the kind of exhaustion that made a man question if he would wake up should he stop moving. When the convoys finally emerged from the black, streaked with mud and sweat, their headlights still dimmed, it was not triumph that filled the air. It was relief. Relief that they would made it through another night, that they would held the line in their own way, on wheels in silence, under cover of stars. Ray once said that no one really saw them. We were just shadows, he smiled. Shadows carrying everything the war needed to keep going. But history remembers. The unsung heroes of the Red Ball Express were more than just drivers. They were warriors in motion, fighting not with bullets but with bravery, discipline, and the unshakable will to keep rolling forward, even when the world around them had gone dark. Even though they were not frontline soldiers, the drivers of the Red Ball Express often found themselves thrown into the heart of danger. Sometimes, with no warning, they were trained to deliver, not to fight. Yet war has a way of ignoring boundaries. As the convoys snaked their way through battered French villages, cratered roads, and over makeshift bridges, the distinction between combatant and non-combatant often vanished in an instant. Some of these drivers, barely out of their teens, found themselves under fire, dodging bullets and bombs meant for infantry units. In the chaos of the Allied advance, the front lines were fluid. One day a route might be deemed secure. The next, it could be swarming with retreating German units regrouping for a last stand. For the drivers, there was no guarantee of safety-only orders. Keep driving. Keep the fuel, food, and ammunition moving. Lives depended on it. Luftwaffe fighter bombers were a constant threat. Though Germany's air force was badly weakened by late 1944, it was far from gone. Occasionally, drivers would spot a glint of sunlight reflecting off metal wings before the dreaded roar of engines filled the sky. Trucks scattered. Drivers dove for ditches. The thunder of machine guns would follow, raking roads and convoys with deadly precision. Some trucks were destroyed on the spot. Others were crippled, but had to be salvaged for their cargo. There was rarely time to mourn. Survivors helped load supplies into other trucks, patched up what they could, and pushed on. The threat was not always from the sky. Ambushes from isolated enemy units or stragglers hiding in the woods were a constant concern. The narrow, winding roads of rural France offered plenty of cover for snipers or small squads intent on disrupting supply lines. Convoys had to be alert, often assigning armed guards or even bristling their trucks with mounted machine guns. Still, a well-placed explosive or sudden burst of fire could scatter even the most disciplined column. In such moments, the drivers did not just transport. They fought, defended, and sometimes died for the mission. Yet what is perhaps more remarkable is that many of these drivers were never formally trained for combat. They were not expected to hold a rifle or return fire under pressure, but when they had to, they did. Some stories tell of drivers repelling attacks on their own, defending their loads and their comrades until help arrived. In one instance, a lone driver held off a German patrol with a malfunctioning Thompson submachine gun and a pile of hand grenades, long enough for his unit to regroup. His heroism never made headlines, but the supplies he saved reached the front lines in time. Most of these encounters were never recorded in official battle reports. They were buried in the memories of those who lived them, or whispered over campfires and in after-action bars. But to ignore them is to ignore the sheer grit and courage it took to keep the Allied machine rolling forward. The irony, of course, is that many of these men were told they were just drivers, that their role, while important, was not one of glory. But on the road, when the shooting started and the bombs dropped, it did not matter whether they wore a gunner's patch or not. They were targets all the same. Even when there were no enemy soldiers in sight, the danger did not end. The roads themselves were hazards, pitted with shell holes, littered with debris, slick with rain or oil. One wrong turn or misjudged curve in blackout conditions could flip a truck or send it hurtling into a ravine. Drivers had to make split-second decisions while fully aware that delay could mean an entire unit ran out of food or ammunition. The stakes were always high, and yet these men kept moving. They formed friendships through shared hardship, looked out for one another when things went wrong, and carried more than just cargo. They carried the momentum of an entire army. Without them, the liberation of Europe might have slowed to a crawl. The cost of their labor, though rarely acknowledged in parades or history books, is written in every successful Allied operation from Normandy to the Rhine. Today, it is easy to remember the great battles, the Normandy landings, the push through the Ardennes, the crossing of the Rhine. But behind every victory was a line of trucks, sometimes hundreds deep, hauling the lifeblood of war through terrain still scarred by conflict. And in each of those trucks sat a driver, tired, determined, sometimes afraid, but always moving forward. Their courage did not always come with medals. Their names might not be etched into the stone of monuments, but they were there, in the mud, under fire, on roads still echoing with war. Their story is one of quiet heroism, of resilience in the face of constant threat. And as we reflect on the price of freedom, we must remember them not just as drivers, but as warriors of the wheel, who risked everything to ensure the road to victory stayed open. The road stretched endlessly before them, rutted, potholed, sometimes barely passable, cutting through war-torn villages, bombed-out bridges, and forests still echoing with gunfire. The truck cab vibrated with every gear shift, and the cold metal seat beneath offered no comfort. For the men of the Red Ball Express, this was not just a highway, it was a lifeline, a thread of steel and diesel fuel, binding the front lines to the ports where supplies poured in. Each mile driven was a gamble. Each delivery made was a quiet victory. Many of the drivers were not trained mechanics, yet they were expected to become roadside engineers under the most brutal conditions. A snapped fan belt, a leaking radiator, a cracked axle. None of these meant rest or delay. These men would crawl beneath their trucks in freezing rain, caked in mud or snow, their fingers numb, sometimes using makeshift tools or parts scavenged from wrecks. There was no repair crew behind them, and often no second chance. Improvisation became survival. These soldiers, young, underpaid, and often unrecognized, kept their machines running, not with luxury, but with raw determination. The hours blurred together. Days melted into nights, and sleep was a fleeting luxury. Their convoys drove under blackout conditions, headlights masked to slivers known as cat eyes. Visibility was nearly non-existent. Taillights of the truck ahead were faint glows in the darkness if they could be seen at all. The drivers leaned forward. squinting through cracked windshields, guided by memory, instinct, and sometimes little more than prayer. One wrong turn in that darkness could mean a crash, a ditch, or worse, a direct encounter with the enemy. Because while these men were not officially combatants, war did not recognize such distinctions. The drivers faced real, immediate dangers. German ambushes still haunted sections of the route. Machine gun fire could rake across a column in seconds. Mines turned dusty paths into deadly traps. And then there were the skies. When Luftwaffe aircraft broke through, they came low and fast. Spitting bullets and fire, trucks swerved wildly, men abandoned their vehicles and dove into ditches, some returning to smoldering frames. Yet the very next morning, those still alive would climb back into whatever they could salvage and continue the drive forward. It was not always bullets and bombs, though. For many, the more persistent enemy was psychological. The relentless pressure, the repetition, the gnawing fatigue, sleep deprivation became a constant companion. Some drivers hallucinated, others fell asleep mid-route, jolting awake only when their truck veered off-road or clipped a tree. Food was often cold, eaten from tin containers on the move. Baths were a rarity. Conversation was brief and functional, centered on fuel loads, tire pressure, engine knocks. Many questioned why their labor, backbreaking and underappreciated, seemed invisible to the broader war narrative. But even amid the weariness, something deeper grew. Pride. The knowledge that without them, the rifles would not fire, the tanks would not roll, and the troops on the front lines would not eat. They were not in the headlines, but they were in every victory. They were the uncelebrated artery of momentum, delivering gasoline, ammo, rations, spare parts, medicine, anything needed to keep the war machine alive. One driver, a 19-year-old from Georgia, recalled how his convoy had to unload an entire shipment by hand after a bridge collapsed. "We passed crates down the line like water buckets at a fire," he said. "There was no glory in it, but we got it done." That was the soul of the Red Ball Express, relentless execution in the face of overwhelming odds, carried out by young men who understood their role, even if few others did. As the war pressed deeper into occupied territory, the demands only increased. The routes grew longer, the loads heavier, the terrain rougher. Yet the drivers kept rolling. They were haunted by the dead they passed along the road and uplifted by the cheers of liberated villagers. They saw the worst and best of humanity from behind the wheel of a 5-ton truck. And though many of them returned home without medals or fanfare, their contribution remains etched into the very framework of the Allied victory. They were more than drivers. They were soldiers of the supply line, guardians of momentum, the quiet hands that kept the gears of liberation turning. So when we remember the great generals, the pivotal battles, and the final victories, we must also remember the young men gripping steering wheels instead of rifles, fixing engines instead of firing weapons, facing exhaustion instead of glory, and never, not once, letting the supply line break. The Red Ball Express was always intended as a stopgap, an emergency artery to feed the front until Europe's shattered railways could be restored. But in the chaotic months following the D-Day landings, when momentum was everything and the Allied advance threatened to outpace its own supply lines, this temporary solution became a lifeline. Its convoys of trucks, often driven by young men barely out of high school, raced against time, terrain, and enemy threats to deliver the essentials of modern war: fuel, food, ammunition, spare parts, and even medical supplies. Without the Red Ball Express, the tanks of Patton's Third Army might have ground to a halt, not from enemy fire, but from empty fuel tanks. By the late summer of 1944, the ports of Normandy were clogged with supplies. Thousands of tons of crates and barrels sat idle on the beaches, waiting to be moved inland. The Allies had expected a slower, more methodical push after D-Day, but success created its own logistical nightmare. Cities were falling faster than the supply system could adapt. Trains could not yet run. Roads were often cratered, and bridges had been destroyed by retreating Germans. Into this breach stepped the Red Ball Express, an improvised network of trucks, depots, drivers, and mechanics that would keep the war machine fed. The urgency of the situation was reflected in every element of the express's design. A single route was carved through northern France, closed to all but military traffic. Convoys were assigned strict timetables. Drivers were briefed on blackout conditions, radio silence, and the necessity of never stopping unless absolutely necessary. The goal was relentless motion. Every hour of delay could mean an idle tank or a starving company at the front. And yet, even with such clear urgency, the operation was far from simple. The young men behind the wheel, many of them African American, serving in segregated units, faced a brutal gauntlet of challenges. They drove through nights so dark they could barely see the truck ahead of them, through rains that turned roads to sludge, through fatigue that made every mile a test of willpower. They dodged enemy fire, navigated destroyed infrastructure, and pushed their overworked engines to the breaking point. But they kept going, because they knew the alternative was worse. As railway lines were slowly repaired, bridges rebuilt, tracks relaid, locomotives brought back to service, the Red Ball Express began to phase out. Trains could move more cargo more efficiently, with fewer risks. But by then, the damage had been done, and the mission accomplished. The Express had kept the Allied spearhead alive during its most vulnerable phase. Without it, the breakout from Normandy might have stalled. Entire operations might have been delayed or canceled. In hindsight, the Red Ball Express occupies a strange place in the war's mythology. It lacks the drama of battlefield heroics or the clear moral victories of liberation. It was, at its core, a logistical effort, a matter of planning, grit, and endurance. But it was also a deeply human story, one of ordinary men performing extraordinary tasks under extraordinary pressure. They were not generals or strategists. They were mechanics, drivers, clerks. And yet, for a few critical months, they became the backbone of the Allied advance. Their trucks are gone now, their routes long since erased by modern highways and quiet forests. But their contribution remains etched in history, not in headlines. Perhaps, but in the quiet success of a campaign that refused to stop moving. They prove that wars are not just won by the men with rifles or the leaders with plans. Sometimes, victory rides on the shoulders of those who keep the engines running and the supplies flowing. The Red Ball Express was temporary, yes, but in its fleeting moment of necessity, it was absolutely vital. As the war pressed on and Europe slowly pulled itself from the wreckage of invasion, the drivers of the Red Ball Express completed their final runs. The convoys that had once thundered down, shattered roads hauling fuel, rations, ammunition, and hope were no longer needed once the railway lines had been repaired and the front pushed ever eastward. But the echoes of their labor did not fade with the engine noise. For many of those men, most of them barely out of their teenage years when they first climbed behind the wheel, the Red Ball Express left more than just memories. It reshaped them. Each jolt on the muddy roads, each night spent driving by instinct under blackout conditions, each time they crawled beneath a stalled truck while shells exploded miles away, these were not just duties. They were trials. And through those trials, something unspoken and solid formed, a sense of endurance that would follow them long after the uniforms came off. Some returned home to quiet towns and used what they learned to build new lives as mechanics, as truck drivers, as logistics coordinators, as men who could solve problems under pressure. The discipline of their missions, the teamwork under duress, the need to improvise with little to no support, all proved valuable in the civilian world. Others, particularly African American drivers, returned to a country that still had not recognized their sacrifice. And yet, many of them still carried pride not just in having served, but in knowing that their efforts were indispensable to victory. The Red Bull Express had proven that when the stakes were high, they could carry the weight of history on their backs. No matter the burden, those who lived through the experience often found it hard to talk about in detail. It was not the glamour of combat, but it was its own brand of courage, quiet, relentless, and gritty. There were moments they would never forget: the eerie silence before dawn after a long night's run, the sudden rattle of gunfire from a hidden ambush, the sound of tires hissing on broken pavement, or the sight of another convoy in the distance moving like ghosts, just barely visible through the fog and dust. What the Red Ball Express showed, perhaps more than anything, was that wars are not won solely by the men holding rifles. They are sustained by the countless others who labor behind the front lines, who drive, repair, refuel, and keep the arteries of an army open. Without them, no breakthrough could be maintained, no liberation completed, no war brought to an end. And so, as we remember the story of these unsung heroes, let us not reduce them to just part of a footnote in history. Let us recognize the grit it took to do that job, day in and day out, without applause, without headlines. Let us remember how they kept the fight alive, not with bullets, but with diesel, with sweat, with determination. Thank you for staying with me through this journey into a lesser-known but vital part of World War II history. If this story moved you, if you believe these voices deserve to be heard more often, I invite you to support this channel. Please like, subscribe, and share this video so more people can discover the human stories hidden behind the battles and dates. And until our next journey together, rest well, stay curious, and as always, sleep peacefully tonight. Good night.